One of the next practices for the wildlife tax valuation is predator control. So we'll spend a little bit of time going over what predator control is and the different aspects of it. First, what is a predator? A predator is an animal species that directly impacts a native wildlife species through direct competition or harm. So what is predator control? Predator control is the management of predators in such a way to directly or indirectly benefit your chosen native wildlife species or group of species. Before we get going into the different aspects of predator control and the different ways that you can use that for your wildlife tax valuation, I want to talk a little bit about why should we control predators. When talking with landowners across the state and across South Texas especially, a lot of people get very focused on predator control, feeling like that might be the most important thing they can do for, say, deer or quail or some other species that they're interested in. And one thing I want to caution you on is that's probably not the most limiting factor when it comes to native wildlife species. When we're talking about native predators such as coyotes or skunks or snakes or bobcats, they are a natural part of the system. So when you're looking at an ecosystem or a landscape, you want to see all the different parts of that ecosystem working together. Predators, native predators, are a part of that system. So if they're missing or reduced artificially, then that ecosystem may not be healthy from the top towards the bottom. So on that note, when you're thinking about predator control, really think about it from a true management perspective and what kind of impacts you're making. But when it comes to exotic animals that might be on your property, that's a different story. Exotic animals such as feral hogs, they are not native to the landscapes. They're not an integral part of the ecosystem. So potentially affecting those non-native species like feral hogs or imported fire ants could be a beneficial thing to the landscape. So before you decide on any kind of predator control, think about the wildlife species you're most interested in and the limiting factors on your land for those wildlife species. I'm not telling you that you shouldn't do predator control as one of your practices, but truly think about, especially for these native predators like bobcats and coyotes and things like that, truly think about that ecosystem as a whole and what impacts you might be making. All right, with that being said, let's go into the different examples of predator control that are available for the wildlife tax valuation. Some of these, like I said, some are about exotic species and some are about some of the native species. So here's a list, as you can see, of the different predator control options, such as feral pig control, exotic fire ant control, feral dog and cat control, brown-headed cowbirds, grackles, starlings, house sparrows, mesomammals, which include raccoons, skunks, things like that, snakes, and then finally bot coyote and bobcat control. I'll talk a little about each one of those. So as far as feral pigs go, feral pigs, as I said, are an exotic species. There's lots of different opportunities and ways that you can work on managing feral pigs on your property. With the wildlife tax valuation, you don't necessarily have to show success, but you have to show effort. So as long as you're putting effort in to try to remove those feral hogs via trapping or hunting or arrow gunning or some other kind of practice, that as long as you're showing that's going to qualify as a practice. So if you do have a feral hog trap out there, use your smartphone, take pictures of when you do trap hogs or when you set it, things like that, and then document how many you harvest each year to kind of keep that process of what's happening on that property and the effort that you're putting in. And then in your annual reports, you can document how many feral pigs you've controlled. Fire ant control. Exotic fire ants are definitely a big problem in a lot of areas. And as far as the effects that they have on our ecosystem, sometimes in a lot of ways it's unknown, but definitely being an exotic species, they can have some impacts on that landscape. With exotic fire ants, there is a effort requirement. You have to be controlling 1% of the infected area or 10 acres annually, whichever is less. So what you would do with that is you would choose choose the infected area that you want to manage, and you want to do at least 1% of that or 10 acres, whichever is less each year as far as your exotic fire ant control. You can use commercial pesticides, but I would caution you on commercial pesticides because of their impacts on native insects, as well as things like boiling water, stuff like that. So just remember, if you're going to use this exotic fire ant predator control, make sure that you are doing enough of the area in order to qualify and document that for the appraisal district. Next, feral dog and cat control. This is an option. I don't want to go into too much detail into this one because I know there's some emotional connections to dogs and cats and things like that, but it is an option that can be used if that is a limiting factor or a big problem on your property. Trapping and transport to animal control, trapping and euthanasia are available, and there is no minimum number requirement, just documentation of effort. Next is brown-headed cowbird control. Cowbirds are a nest parasite where they actually will lay their eggs in the nests of other songbird species, and those eggs will hatch early and then push out the eggs or the young of the other species, and the parent bird will feed. The parent bird could be another species, will feed that young, and so it can have a pretty big impact on nesting songbirds in your area. So it does require a TPWD training and online training that is free, and the dates to trap that are legal to trap are March 1 through May 31. It requires removal of at least 30 cowbirds annually to qualify, so there's your intensity requirement. And I suggest if you're interested in brown-headed cowbird control, reach out to your local TPWD biologist and learn a little bit more about how that works and how you could incorporate that into your wildlife management program. Next are grackles, starlings, and English house sparrow control. Starlings and English house sparrows are exotic species, so they are not protected through by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act as far as how if when they can be controlled. So if you do have, say, a house sparrow or starling problems on your property, you can use that as one of your practices. Grackles, these long-tailed grackles, which you've probably seen at your local supermarket in the evenings and things like that, are native species. However, they are there's a depredation order on those guys. As long as they are depredating, you can prove that they're causing a depredation issue or problems like that, or about to do that. You can remove those as well. If you intend to use grackle control as one of your practices, I suggest you reach out to your Parks and Wildlife biologist to learn more about that and make sure that you stay within the legal restrictions as far as a native species like a grackle. Starlings and English house sparrows, on the other hand, those guys, like I said, are not protected as they're an exotic species. So you can manage those how you'd like. There is an intensity requirement. You have to remove at least 30 grackles, starlings, or sparrows annually in order to qualify and document that removal. Next are mesomammal control. That's raccoons, skunks, things like that. Raccoons and skunks are one of the primary nest predators of species like bobwhite quail. They also, if you use a lot of feeders for deer or turkey, you're probably going to see a lot of raccoons getting into your feeders and causing problems. So a lot of people like to try to control those species through trapping and stuff like that. Again, for this one, there is no intensity requirement. You just have to document effort. So make sure that if you're going to do this, again, document your effort and the amount that you control annually so that you can send that in your annual report to the appraisal district. Snake control, same thing here. Again, think about what your limiting factors for the wildlife species that you're interested in managing for and how you can do those practice to manage for those species. So if you want to do some snake control, that is an option. Again, there is no intensity requirement, but you have to show effort. So if you're going to approach this control method, make sure that you are documenting your effort, and so you can put that in your annual report. Finally, we have coyote and bobcat control. Like we talked about earlier, remember when it comes to predators, predators aren't generally always your limiting factor, especially native predators aren't a limiting factor for the major limiting factor for wildlife species on most properties. So if you're going to approach this as your one of your practices, make sure that you have a you have good goals for why you're doing that. It could be if you're interested in white-tailed deer and you want to manage intensively for trophy white-tailed deer, that you might be doing some coyote or bobcat control so that you can make sure as many fawns live as possible so you have more deer to harvest. But again, it goes back to why are you choosing this option and what impact is it going to have on those wildlife species that you're interested in?